feet while I run this race. Guide my feet while I run this race. Guide my feet while I run this race, for I don't want to run this race in vain.
Okay, in addition to having some really historical figures buried in this cemetery, including one of George Washington's pallbearers, the reason for the Star-Spangled Banner, and other things, we have here the grave of Francis Lee Smith. Now, Francis Lee Smith was an extremely wealthy Alexandrian prior to the American Civil War. He was very active in the legal profession, and when the war started, the American Civil War started, when Alexandria was invaded May 23, 24, 1861 by the Union. In fact, Alexandria was the first occupied town in the South. Mr. Francis Lee Smith fled to Richmond, Virginia, as did most of the wealthy Alexandrians. Francis Lee Smith owned a lot of property in Alexandria, and one of them is the house at 510 Wolf Street, and it's still there today. It was the tallest and biggest house in Alexandria. Had a rooftop that you could go out on and see the Potomac River, and then the heights to the west of camp. But he flees Alexandria, and his house is quickly taken over by the military authorities and used first as a military headquarters for the city of Alexandria, and later on as a hospital. Alexandria, in the end, was mostly a hospital and a depot for the Army of the Potomac as they fought against Robert E. Lee's Army in Northern Virginia. So, one reason we're here today is later on this tour, you're going to go to a place called the Freedmen Cemetery. That was owned by Francis Lee Smith. Because he did not show up in person to pay taxes, property taxes that were due on the property, the federal authorities confiscated his land and turned it into a cemetery for contrabands and freedmen. Now, who here knows what contrabands are? Okay, contrabands were, of course, the term applied to slaves who fled their masters, first down at Fort Monroe in Hampton, Virginia. Ironically, during the war, when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, part of it was that slaves could be armed. I'm sure you've heard the great song, "We're coming, Father Abraham, 300,000 strong." That applies to the African Americans who are going to be given weapons and taught how to do warfare. Well, 100 of them or so were originally buried in Freedmen Cemetery, but early about 1864, survivors of disease and war over at a hospital just to the west of us, African Americans, they call the U.S. colored troops, rose up in revolt. And they said, no, we do not want that. We are Americans. We fought for Americans. We need to be treated like Americans. And so after the war in 1866, they were disinterred from that cemetery and put over in the cemetery just through the trees here, which is the second oldest national cemetery in existence, 1862. That's when it started. About 4,000 Union troops, including quite a few African American, they called U.S. colored troops. Ironically, after the war, Francis Lee Smith tried to get his land back, but he could not. And his principal client after the war was a guy by the name of Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee's house was also confiscated during the American Civil War for non-payment of taxes. And he advised Mr. Lee not to pursue trying to get back Arlington Mansion and the surrounding plantation.
Guide my feet while I run this race, for I don't want to run this race in vain.
So I'm here at the gravesite of Lewis Mackenzie. Lewis Mackenzie was the Unionist mayor of the city of Alexandria during the American Civil War. He was a member of the old Presbyterian meeting house, and for those who go to the meeting house, if you go down the center aisle on the south side, there's on the pews has a little silver plaque on it with his name, date of birth, and date of death on it. That was his pew when he was a member of the meeting house. A very successful entrepreneur, a very successful businessman, a very successful politician prior to the American Civil War. If you've ever, how many folks here toured on the W.O.&D. Railroad? Okay, that was started by him. It was originally it was called the Alexandria, Loudon, and Hampshire Railroad, and then later on it became the WOND, and then it was given up, I guess, in the 1980s. Government took over. It's now a wonderful bike path that goes from Shirlington all the way out to Loudon County. Well, that was his work. So kind of give you an idea of his day, what he's doing for us. But I brought you here today because of several things. In this gravesite is Julia Quander. You ever seen Quander Road in Alexandria? That was named after the enslaved folks that worked at Hayfield, who were part of the Washington farms. Most of the enslaved folks who were there, and they're named Quander. The first Quander was Nancy Quander. She actually worked at the mansion plantation, or George Washington's plantation. But most of them were over here, and after they were free, they kind of congregated around that area, hence the name Quander Road. So, interesting enough, we're trying to figure out more about Julia Quander because she's relatively young. Why is she in this plot? We really don't know. There's a lot of different suppositions going around. Interesting enough also, if you look at the records of the manumission slave records in Alexandria, that go from 1890s all the way to 1863, the last person who was manumitted, or manumission, I think it's the correct word, was Julia Quander's mother, and that was in 1863. You ask them, hey, wait a second, the American Civil War, what's this all about? I thought the slaves were free with the Emancipation Proclamation. Slaves only freed in occupied parts of the South. Alexandria, which was occupied by the North, Delaware, Maryland, slaves were not freed until after either a manumission or was it the 14th Amendment came into place and freed them. So the last note thing in that long log is the freedom of this gal's mother in 1863, who was signed by Mackenzie. And we don't know why. What we do know is a judge of the common courts in Alexandria, and maybe that's part of his role. And there's some dangling stories that maybe he was involved with his mother, we don't know, and that she could have been a daughter, we don't know. So it's interesting. It just kind of tells you the threads of society, African Americans and white Americans throughout our history, and how we are all part of one group. So, any other questions? Any questions? Okay, I want to thank you. You guys got to move on and do other things. Thank you, sir. For you?
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I just want to mention, I mean, we laid out these stories, and just imagine what their lives are like. They were all born into a deeply hierarchical, a caste society, and yet they're Presbyterians. So there's some tension between the two. How do you live in such a society? To some extent, Smith was a peaceful man. He went along with things, and yet he had to flee. And here's Mackenzie, who is possibly in some respects disorderly. I mean, he goes with the union, he's pro-unionist, and he has these relations with the Quanders and so forth. So, you know, you just have to consider our society before the Civil War was based on this deep set of legal inequality, but also a whole culture that set people apart. And yet our faith gives us some other thoughts about how to live. We don't live in this world. We respond to another way to live.
Guide my feet while I run this race, for I don't want to run this race in vain.
The Frederick Douglass Cemetery was named much later, after African Americans had been buried here since 1826. The surrounding neighborhood was known as the Bottoms, and after the Civil War, the Burg, after Petersburg, because so many people came here to this area. And the African American community claimed this this land and began burying, we assume, enslaved people and freed. And in 1895, some leaders in the black community and businessmen, they honored the cemetery with this name, and in honor of the famous abolitionist Frederick Douglass. It fell into disuse in the 20th century. The city finally took ownership, but only about 5 years ago, a Boy Scout troop from St. Joseph Catholic Church decided that it deserved more honor. And so they cleaned this up as part of an Eagle Scout project. They arranged for this sign with the quotation from Frederick Douglass. There are only 700 markers remaining today, although by scanning they know over 2,000 were buried here. One grave keeper who also took care of the Penny Hill Cemetery, which is down that direction. That was the Paupers Cemetery. He mentioned that many of the graves that were not marked were surrounded by clam shells to identify the grave site. The origin of this practice may be from the Gullah community on the seashores of the southeast, but the shell, the sea, symbolic of the spirit being carried to its new place. So take a moment and we will share a special song. "O Freedom," a song for enslaved peoples that came from their communities to express the constant desire for freedom from their conditions, freedom in this world and freedom in the world to come. And it was adopted, of course, after the Civil War and in the Civil Rights era as a freedom movement song for justice and civil rights.
Oh, freedom. And go home to my Lord and be free.
Good morning, everyone. Hello. Hi, I'm Dr. Presbyterian. I just made it right at the first tour, so I just wanted the opportunity to say good morning and thank you all for joining. And so we are at our third stop called the Freedom House Museum. Freedom House is now a museum. The building was used as a large holding pen for enslaved people prior to their auction at the East Coast major auction site. Prior to sale, the people were often clothed and fed so well so as to increase the price that they would fetch. This is a process called seasoning. It reminds me of when enslaved Africans made their way to the coast of West Africa and their bodies were oiled such that it could hide the blemishes, so that inspectors who were purchasing them thought that they were much more healthier than they were after the long march from the interior of West Africa to the host. And so occasionally from this location, individual enslaved were sold downriver. This refers specifically to the Mississippi, but the Potomac was also a mighty river of slavery that satisfied the high demand for labor on southern plantations. A sale would often break up a family, and the person could anticipate unspeakable misery. And so this is a place where enslaved people were separated from their families. Women and men and children, families were born apart. This location is also significant because as a museum, it bears witness to the history of African Americans living in Alexandria. It also bears witness to some of the atrocious acts that have happened here in local history. For example, this museum highlights the lynching of Benjamin Thomas. Benjamin Thomas was lynched on August 8, 1899, and he was a 16-year-old African American boy. And as we think about what it means to have Black Lives Matter in this time, we understand that museums and monuments, for that matter, continue to highlight the contested and conflicted history of our past. In fact, the city of Alexandria purchased the Freedom House to preserve historic museum from the Northern Virginia Urban League, actually this year on March 25th, 2020. So we can see that this is an important history and museum to the monuments and the sacrifices and the contested history of African Americans and the rights here in Alexandria, Virginia. We will transition now into a song called Steal Away. This traditional American song is a byproduct of the Underground Railroad. The catch-all term used to describe a means in which slaves escaped from their owners to go northern on to Canada to live in freedom. Steal away, like so many African American spirituals, actually has two meanings. When we hear the word steal away, it represented not only African Americans fleeing enslaved places to go north to freedom, but it also recognized going home to glory with Jesus. And so as you hear this verse of Steal Away, think about what it means to be at this place where formerly enslaved people were held until they were sent away to places to begin the next chapter of their lives as prisoners and enslaved people. So steal away.
Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. Steal away, steal away home. I ain't that long to stay here. My Lord, He calls me by the thunder. The trumpet sounds within my soul. I ain't that long to stay here. My Lord, He calls me. He calls me by the FREDERICK. A trumpet sounds within my soul. I ain't that long to stay here.
So we see that slave traders continuously owned this property until 1861. Steal away to Jesus, I don't have long to stay here. So we remember today, and we think about now that this is a place, a museum, where enslaved people were held, but is now a place where we bear witness before they departed to places as far south as Mississippi. And so at this time we continue.
Guide my feet while I run this race. Guide my feet while race in vain.
This is a stop at a non-event. Was until a few weeks ago the APPOMATTOX statue. This is a picture. It was depicted a Southern soldier, quite a nice-looking young man, standing in what many saw as a grieving pose with his back to Washington, D.C. in the north. So many saw him as a representation of the grief and the sorrow that the Southerners felt at the loss of a large part of the generation of young men at that time. And he was seen as grief-stricken. However, this loss also fed a lot of resentment and antagonism, and led to the formation of the lost cause myth. What the Southerners told themselves to comfort themselves was loss. And that in turn led to more despicable, even more despicable things. The statue was dedicated on May 24th, 1889. While there were many, at that point, the Jim Crow laws were beginning to be founded. One of the things that we were talking about with this is that when I discussed this with my mother, who is from Columbus, Georgia, she said, just about every little southern town had a cemetery, and its cemetery had a statue like this that was called Coming Home. And so, like I said, that grief, it turned into the resentment and anger that we later saw in the South. When the statue was up, Tom Tolles of the Post depicted the statue in a political cartoon on June 15th. He labeled the toppled figure as overt racism, while the remaining foundation was labeled economic inequality. His side comment was, "Don't forget the pedestal, heavier still." Perhaps in an effort to say that it was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 2017, but it was nonetheless removed on June 2nd, 2020. Let us repeat together the collective spoken prayer. God, we are the source of human dignity, and it is in your image that we are created. Your elements, your absence, and compassion enable us to reverence each person, to value and appreciate those who are different from us. Grant us in all ways love, justice, and self-compassion. I taught a Bible study one time, and one of the people in the study who was a doctor, I think, reflected this prayer very well. When he said, I try to teach it. I try to treat everybody that comes into my office as if they were Jesus Christ himself. And I think that's, very, very touching.
Guide my feet while I run this race, for I don't want to run this race in vain.
Welcome to BEULAH Baptist Church. This is a very historic church with special meaning where Baptist and Presbyterian stories come together in some ways. A young man named Clem Robinson, just ordained as a Baptist preacher in Philadelphia, he heard that the Federals had come to Alexandria in order to protect Potomac and the capital, and they'd taken the region over. And many former enslaved people and people who were escaping slavery came to the district for the protection of federal troops, or came to this area for the protection of federal troops. He rushed down here to begin an education endeavor. Now, the interesting thing about Reverend Robinson was that he had a higher education, a college degree from the Ashland Institute. was a Virginian, but he was able to get there to get an education because it was illegal in Virginia to get any kind of education as a black person, free or enslaved. And the passion for education brought him to this area. Ashman Institute was founded by Presbyterians, and it was really one of the earliest historic black colleges and universities, and we think the first to offer a college-level degree. He brought higher learning here and founded the first colored school in the area, for the first select colored school for children whose families had either been formerly enslaved or had been thirsting for an education in this area. And then he founded the church the next year, the school in 1862, the church in 1863, and by the 1865 he was running a full-blown upper school called the BEULAH Theological and Normal Institute. Normal meaning like normal schools, teacher education in those days. This is very historic because it is the first theological school founded during Reconstruction. There's only one other school that's older for African Americans, and that's the Wilberforce in Ohio, but it was being reconstituted about the same time. So Clem Robinson was able to found the first theological school for African Americans in the entire region, and it was an unusual story founded by black leadership coming out of this church. The school thrived, both the lower school and the upper school. There were 700 children in the lower school. In some years there were over 80 in the upper school some years, and the theological school and normal school graduated many students that went into ministry and into teaching. The sad part of this great accomplishment has to do, we think, with some of the northern mission societies that supported the schools. These were mission societies in white dominant Baptist churches, denominations, and others. And when they heard that white people were opening schools, theological schools, for black people, they said, oh, we need to support that. And so Wayland Seminary was one that later joined with Virginia Union in Richmond, and Howard University and its theological department was another. So all of that money was taken away, we think, to support these white-led schools for African Americans. And it was a great loss, of course, to this area. There were property disputes about this church. The black community and Robinson and others fought it. They had to give up the church for a year, and it went back to the previous owners that had it before the war, but then they collected the money and bought it back, and hence the church survived and the school continued for some years. After Robinson ended his tenure as pastor in 1875, he continued to work for the Free Public School Society of Alexandria and supporting open public education for children, and was a pioneer in this effort with many women educators and some men in the community that actually joined the city council in town. It's a wonderful place to welcome a group with us today that I did not welcome in the beginning and intended to. We have with us Baptist brothers and sisters in our midst from the Justice Formation Fellowship, and we are delighted that you're part of this walk with us.
Guide my feet while I run this race. Guide my feet while I run this race.
So here we are at the Alexandria Academy. The Alexandria Academy was founded for the white children here in Alexandria. And And it was founded by the Old Presbyterian Meeting House in 1786. And it was also partly supported by George Washington. They got a pastor from Scotland to be the first schoolmaster, and they had a free school on the 3rd floor for boys and girls of families who could not afford a tuition. Presbyterian pastors of OP&H were on the board for many years, and several were instructors of classical languages. During the Civil War, the school was used by one of the first free colored schools. Presbyterians promoted education throughout the South and Middle States, and in some schools, different classes and genders could mix and experience each other, acting necessarily not as equals, but as fellow learners. A few schools, like the Berea School in Kentucky, allowed races to study together. Although we are all still promoting across identity boundaries, the question is, how well is it working? The Academy prepared a lot of the supporters and leaders of the Confederacy, including Robert E. Lee. And Robert E. Lee's life had many ironies. He was a devout Christian, but he was also a slave owner. He was somebody who taught his slaves to read, especially when they were about to be freed by his father-in-law's will. Actually, they got freed by the Emancipation first. But so he was a slave master, but he also taught these slaves to read in violation of Virginia law. But then he turned around and stood with Virginia against the Union. He told people that he did not want any memorials to himself, no statues built that reflected him, and yet he became an icon of the lost cause we talked about earlier that romanticized the antebellum Civil War, and the ideology was mostly in the hands of others. So here we are. Here's our prayer. Let us read this communal prayer. Help us accept each other as Christ accepted us. Teach us as sister, brother, each person to embrace. Be present, Lord, among us, and bring us to thee, all people, acceptance and to love and love. Teach us to care for all people, not just for some. To love them as we find them, or as they may become.
Guide my feet while I run this race, for I don't want to run this race in vain.
Okay, this is a half a stop. I just wanted to point out, and you can't quite see it, but on Washington Street there is a facility that has always been known as the Old Club. There was a building taken from Huntington Creek and brought over right there on Washington Street, and it became the premier men's club. And that's where General Washington used to hang out, along with George Mason and other luminaries. And obviously it was the cream of society and the richest people and all white, of course. But I just wanted to point that out. And it became somebody else's house later, but then it became a the major restaurant in town in the 1940s, segregated, of course, and up until about the late 70s it was shut down and nothing happened there, but a sign was still left that said George Washington's Club. And in a few years back it was turned into super luxury townhouses. And so I just wanted to point out that's something that Americans do a lot of. Tocqueville said Americans just love to create associations and clubs and so forth. So we have the the premier men's club right there, and now we're going to pass to the Departmental Progressive Club, and I'll tell you some more about that. Okay, we heard about the old club, but in 1927, this club was started, the Departmental Progressive Club, and sounds like an odd name, but there were 7 men in 1927. They were all African American men who had jobs in the federal government in various departments, and hence the name Departmental. Let me just tell you a story about one of its members. It's Lawrence P. Robbie Robinson, very interesting man, born in 1931. After the World War II, Cameron Station, not too far, you know, in Alexandria, is a naval supply station. And after the war, they started to think about, well, who had the jobs at the commissary? And they figured, oh, the bagger of groceries at the commissary, that is considered servitude, and we can't allow Marines to do that job. So they said, well, okay, let's just open it up to you know, people in the community, and that's where Robbie Robinson decided that was his opportunity. So he took that job as a bagger at the commissary. Well, he kept working at Cameron Station and then eventually Fort Belvoir for 50 years, and he ended up the head of the Defense Logistics Agency division at Fort Belvoir, which is quite a big position. But during that time, he was very active in uplift of his community, and he ended up on all the boards of all the black organizations. Again, organizations all over the place, very American thing to do. And he was he just had to be there because he created a tremendous amount of fellow feeling and support for his community. Now, it's uncertain as to why he did so well and did so much for his community, but he was a direct descendant of what's referred to as James Gentleman Jim Robinson, who was an interesting character. Before the Civil War, he was a major landowner in Manassas. Now, how did that happen? Well, he was referred to as the 3rd richest African American in the country at the time. And the only way legally that he could have owned land was if he was born free. Well, it turns out that his mother had been manumitted by one of the Carters, Landon Carter Jr., and that allowed her to have freeborn children, and he made the most of it. So it's just an interesting observation of people getting life chances, and for African Americans, maybe often not so many chances, but every once in a while somebody came through. But as we saw in this Departmental Progressive Club, it was kind of a separate way to get ahead, and perhaps the legacy of Gentleman Jim, you know, gave this sense of achievement and just plain hope to be able to thrive as an African American despite the difficulties of segregation. So, and just one little note, it was about 30 years ago that an OPMH member asked somebody here, can we park in your parking lot on Sunday morning? And then there was a handshake. So ever afterward, you know, I've been parking there.
Guide my feet while I run this race, for I don't want to run this race in vain.
Good
Good morning. I'm Don Dahlman, Chair of the Congregation's History and Archives Committee, and I welcome you to the Old Presbyterian Meeting House. While you sit here, look at that building, which was the parsonage. Look at the meeting house, which was rebuilt in the 1830s, but originally constructed in 1775. Both of those buildings would have, as any of the building you saw today from the 18th century, would have been built with slave labor. This was erected by the local builder, Robert Brockett. He had slaves at his brick making operation. But on the building you would have either had slaves. We had 100 members in this congregation owned slaves. So there would have been slave labor available. This is in the 1780s, 1770s. There would essentially be no freedmen in Alexandria. The colony did not pass a manumission law allowing individuals to manumit their slaves without an act of the General Assembly in 1782. People, white plantation owners at least, immediately thought this was the biggest mistake that Virginia ever made. When you think about Virginia as a colony, do not think of Williamsburg, do not think of Mount Vernon, think of Barbados, think of Jamaica. Think of a culture, a European culture. We talk about 15th to the 17th century as the age of exploration. Think of it as the age of colonization by European powers of the rest of the earth, as much of the rest of the earth as they could. The one big successful colonizer, Spain, the New World, extracted hundreds of tons of gold, thousands of tons of silver, all with slave labor. That's what a successful colony meant. What did we produce? A health hazard, carcinogen, a heart disease from tobacco, right? Consumer goods right from the beginning. That was the best we did here, except in South Carolina with indigo and rice and other things. That's what we were emulating. Creating wealth for the homeland, not making wealthy people here. Huge numbers of acts here. We were like pirates and doing illegal acts all the time, because people, once they moved here, they wanted to create wealth for themselves. There's no currency because you were not allowed. They wanted to control, so the money goes back to England. Not until the 1780s, after we'd written and fought at War of Independence and those documents, we hold these truths to be self-evident, did anybody, any religious denomination as a denomination, act against slavery. Isaac Stockton Keith, who lived here, minister, was on the committee for overtures in 1784 and wrote for the first act by the Presbyterian Church against the institution of slavery. James Muir, who lived here with his family, end of the 1780s till 1820, was on a church committee to the third statement, and Elias Harrison, who lived here from 1820 thereafter and was minister here till 1863, was involved with the fourth statement. The Quakers and Presbyterians joined together in 1795 to form an abolition society. Within the year of its establishment, the General Assembly made it illegal to have such a body anywhere in the state. And there was if you provided any assistance to a freedman who had been arrested perhaps and was being forced, going to be sold by the local government back into slavery, any assistance whatsoever, an immediate $100 fine, which meant something in 1795. The congregation, although there are more than 100 slave owners, African Americans as full communicant members throughout the 18th and 19th century, including marriages, baptisms, taking communion together, I don't know, and marriages, several high-profile marriages of African Americans. Ford West in 1812, who established Gum Springs here in Northern Virginia, and Paul Jennings, who was a manservant for James Madison while President of the United States, wrote the first tell-all story about life in the White House, and was one of the leaders of the Pearl escape attempt from Washington, D.C. And he and Desdemona, who happened to be from Alexandria, were married by Elias Harrison. None of that is recorded in any Alexandrian. Probably, and I have brochures if you want on the congregation's history. 80% of what I have discovered in this congregation's history has never been talked about. And I find that once the Washington newspapers were established in the 19th century, there's more about what's actually going on here in Washington newspapers than you would read about in the Alexandria Gazette. 1795, that first abolition society established a Sunday school explicitly for African Americans. The congregation from 1790s until 1847, we're part of the District of Columbia. The world changes completely, which is why half of the African Americans living in Alexandria left in 1846 and went to the District of Columbia when we reverted back to becoming part of Virginia. A Sunday school in 1816 with African Americans attending. A second abolition society, 1827, trying to abolish the slave trade in the District of Columbia. Elias Harrison was a national director of the American Colonization Society with colonization to Liberia, manumitting slaves. Civil War. We started organizing the Union Association to organize African Americans already in 1861. These people were prepared to vote. Wow. The first federal election, when it was allowed, the city officials did not allow African Americans to vote, but a separate polling place was established, and members of the congregation went to the Congress to have their vote counted. It did not. Through Reconstruction government, a governor, attorney general, Supreme Court justice all came from this congregation. And the congregation, which by then we always had more members coming from Connecticut and Rhode Island than we did from the rest of Virginia. This was a commercial town like Philadelphia or Baltimore. By the end of the 1890s, we had always been part of the national denomination, did not use the word northern, the national denomination, and they couldn't convince a clergyman to come to this town to serve them from the national denomination. And the elders and congregation said they'd rather close the doors than call a minister from the Southern Presbyterian Church. And that's what they did. The doors, church bell rang for 4 days when George Washington died, among other, for the Emancipation Proclamation on record, and yesterday, 2 days ago, for Constitution Day. It's closed for 50 years, 1949, and in clergy involved in keeping the public schools open in the 1950s. In 1968, the Reverend Bill Sangle participated in memorial service for Martin Luther King at T.C. Williams High School and suggested that the city, out of respect for its African American citizens, not fly the Confederate battle flag on Washington Street and King Street for Memorial Day, which produced student protests. And the next year, as the city manager, and they flew that year. The next year, the city manager told Bill Sangle's wife, "I just couldn't find them." To put them up, and the world changes, right? But it takes it, right? So this year, exercise your right to vote and stay eternally vigilant. Thank you.
Amen.
Hide my feet while I run this race. Guide my feet while I run this race. Guide my feet for I don't want to run this race in vain.
Again, good afternoon, everyone. We want to thank you all for taking the time to join us on this tour as we have a reflectively engaged conversation and reflection around Presbyterians and race, a reflective experience in power and justice. And we have now concluded our tour, coming to this, the final resting place of more than 1,800 African Americans who are buried in this field. This field is known, this cemetery is known as the Contraband and Freedmen Cemetery. Contrabands fled Alexandria when the Civil War began. At first, they were held by federal troops in the city jails. They were fugitives, indeed property, returned. That was the law. Their status remained uncertain. About 1,800 African Americans were buried in this field, both contraband and some free, and some black Union soldiers who were later interned at the Alexandria National Cemetery next to the Presbyterian Cemetery. This cemetery was forgotten and the site used as a gas station. It was also disrupted by the Beltway and Wilson Bridge construction. In 2014, it was restored as a memorial park. Even today, we are still resurrecting our lost history as we as a nation grapple with what does it mean to be free today, despite the color of our skin, or our gender, or our sexuality. Those escaping from slavery found a safe haven in Alexandria because of the Union occupation, but their large numbers resulted in a refugee crisis. While many found unemployment, other contrabands, as the freedmen were officially known, were destitute after slavery, and as the website shared, arrived hungry and in ill health. Many were housed in barracks and disease was rampant. In 1864, after hundreds had perished, the superintendents of the contrabands ordered that a property on the southern edge of town, across from the Catholic cemetery in my background, be confiscated for use as a cemetery. In the first year, burials include those of black soldiers, but other African American troops as well. The cemetery fell into disrepair, and a brickyard and railroad cutting encroached upon it. The cemetery appeared on maps until 1939. In 1955, a gas station, can you believe that, was built on the property, followed by an office building. And then more than 30 years later, historical research revealed the presence of a long forgotten cemetery, in some respect, burying our national history. And so plans for rebuilding the Woodrow Wilson Bridge resurrected this cemetery in conversation, thus leading to the memorial where we stand today. And so we stand mostly as Presbyterians and some Baptists in our midst, amen? And we stand today in the presence of these remains of freedmen, freed women, and children. Not only contrabands, but individuals and families with hopes and aspirations, dreams and visions of what they decided was the promise of emancipation in 1861. As I tell my students at Bowie State University in the history department that our history will either be our landing strip or our launching pad. As we bear witness to the story of Presbyterians and race, a reflective experience in power and social justice, how do we question our complicity and our commitment to a beloved community that engages radical acts of hospitality? Martin Luther King, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said in a letter from a Birmingham jail that whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And we know that indeed painful experience, that through painful experience, that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. But part of the ways in which we demand freedom is by bearing true to witness. We are all yet struggling to still be free, regardless of your race or your gender. We live in a nation where we can freely worship. Others don't have that freedom. Martin Luther King also said that we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, ties in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. That tells me that the rights of one person are violated, that it impacts all of us. And so change is contagious, but change requires that we have action. Part of the way that we have action is to think about our history, meditate on what it meant in that time, and then bear to mind what we will do once we know the truth. This monument and the museums and the many other places along our tour today remind us. Surely, as even in my congregation, I have a parishioner who traces her history to Alexandria. And we had a long conversation this morning about what it meant to walk the city blocks of Alexandria. And in our tour today, when I first came in conversation with the Reformed Institute, and we were really grappling with what this tour meant, one word that came to mind was complicity. Another word that came to mind was white supremacy. Yet another word that came to mind was privilege. All of those words have significant meaning. And surely as the church today, we are grappling with what it means to be God's child in 2020. The 223rd General Assembly 2018 approved item 1111, and they declared it as the decade of intercultural transformation, or the ways in which we think about how the church is, say it with me, reformed and always reforming. But in order for the church to be reformed and always reformed, we must, or reforming, we must not only revisit our past, but we must engage in intentional steps that require transformation and reconciliation. Whether the organization is called the Reformed Institute or 15th Street Presbyterian Church or the Old Meeting House, whatever the organization or church, we are yet always asking this question: what is the missio Dei of God? What is the mission of God for us in this moment? And so I invite you all into a moment of silence as we remember, we reflect, and we pay honor to those who this side recognize as their final resting place. Let us observe a moment of silence before our collective spoken prayer. So we give God thanks and we give God praise for the 800 plus African Americans who are buried here, some free, some contraband, some still yet seeking where freedom meets in these United States. And may their lives, their legacies, their final resting place bear witness to complicity of past individuals. It may also be a call to action today to us that what we do impacts each other directly and indirectly. And so I pray that this tour has convicted and challenged and inspired us all to action in the name of Jesus Christ in some way. Let us pray collectively together. Our prayer included in our tour guide. Would you pray with me? Ever-present God, you called us to be in relationship with one another and promise to dwell wherever two or three are gathered. In our community, we are many different people. We come from many different places, have many different cultures. Open our hearts that we may be bold in finding the riches of inclusion and the treasures of diversity among us. We pray this in faith. Amen. And so I invite you to visit this place again and some of the places that we have stopped and paid homage and engaged in reflection. And I pray that this is not the ending of our experience and reflection today, but that the reflection beyond this moment will continue, and that it will shape forward-moving action as we dare to be the church reformed and dare to continue to ask the question, how might we be our brothers and sisters as we are the Church of Christ? Amen, and thank you for listening. But we will have one verse of Guide My Feet from Yvonne.
Guide my feet while I run this race. Guide my feet while I run this race. Guide my feet while I run this race, for I don't